For miles, the car's headlights were the only source of light in the jungle. They traveled a road few chose after the sun went down. They were heading to a friend's wedding 7 hours away. Extra hours at the office had pushed their departure into the late evening, leaving them to navigate the longest stretch of the trip in total darkness. To save time, they opted for a secondary route that cut through the interior of a vast forest. It was a path that bypasses major towns, trading main highway safety for a narrow dirt track without cell towers. Before falling asleep in the passenger seat, Rohan mentioned that the locals avoid this stretch of the highway at night. He spoke of stories where the road itself seemed to change, but Sumit just focused on the odometer. Fatigue and the steady hum of the tires eventually masked the reality of their situation. By the time the radio signals faded into static, they were deep within the trees, far beyond the reach of any passing help. The engine suddenly let out a sharp, metallic grind. Within seconds, a plume of gray smoke began rising from under the hood, forcing Sumit to pull the car to a halt on the shoulder of the dirt path. Sumit stepped out into a silence that felt heavy. The only sound was the cooling of the engine and the faint hiss of steam. Outside the reach of the headlights, the jungle was an impenetrable wall of black. In the shifting haze of the smoke, Sumit thought he saw a figure standing just a few yards away. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the space was empty. Shaken and sensing a change in the air, he got back inside and forced the engine to turn over one more time. As the car began to move, the lights caught a person standing in the center of the road. Sumit jerked the wheel to avoid a collision, sending the car sliding off the dirt and slamming into a large boulder. The impact stopped the car instantly. With the engine dead and wedged against the rock, their link to the world was severed. Sumit came to with his head resting against the steering wheel. He looked over at Rohan, who was sitting perfectly upright. Rohan showed no signs of injury from the crash, but he refused to answer when Sumit called his name. Suddenly, Rohan's phone began to ring. Even though there was no network signal for miles, the device vibrated with a high-pitched tone and emitted a glare so bright it filled the entire cabin. When Rohan finally turned to look at Sumit, his features had changed. His pupils were gone, leaving nothing but white spheres that seemed to glow in the shadow of the car. Without a word, the figure lunged across the console, pinning Sumit against the door. It hissed and clawed with a strength that didn't feel human. The friend Sumit had known was gone, replaced by a physical shell that seemed to be under the control of something else, something that was now using Rohan's body to hunt Sumit within the confines of the vehicle. Sumit's hand found a heavy rock on the floor mat. He struck Rohan's head until the grip loosened, giving him enough time to scramble out the door. He locked the doors from the outside, but it didn't stop the pursuit. Rohan leaped onto the roof, the metal groaning and bucking under the weight as fingers began to puncture through the steel ceiling of the car. Realizing the car offered no protection, Sumit abandoned it and ran blindly into the thicket, guided by the heavy sound of crashing brush behind him. The chase ended when Sumit was tackled to the ground. As hands tightened around his throat once more, he grabbed an iron rod from the dirt and struck Rohan's skull repeatedly until the body finally stopped moving. To survive the night, Sumit had been forced to take the life of his best friend. Exhausted and covered in dust, he collapsed in the dirt as the jungle returned to its unnatural silence. A week later, Sumit woke up in a hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights and the presence of a police officer at the door signaled that he was finally back in civilization. This chart compares Sumit's account with the evidence gathered by the authorities. While Sumit described a wreckage, the police reported finding his car parked neatly on the shoulder of the highway. There were no signs of a crash, no dents, and the roof was perfectly intact. Most confusing of all was the state of the jungle floor. There was no trace of Rohan, no blood, and no signs that a struggle had ever taken place where Sumit claimed to have fought for his life. The doctor suggested that the isolation of the road and the lack of sleep had triggered a state of trauma-induced delirium, causing Sumit to imagine the entire confrontation. With the physical world standing in direct opposition to his memories, Sumit was left to face a new terror. If the evidence was right, then he had spent the night fighting shadows. The doctor's explanation lasted until that night. In the silence of the hospital room, Sumit saw a figure standing in the corner. It had Rohan's face and that same hollow smile, watching him from the shadows. The figure whispered that this was not over. It promised that the road trip was only the first step in a much longer journey. Sumit's reactions to the figure led the staff to believe he was a danger to himself. He was moved from the hospital to a psychiatric asylum, where he was kept in a room designed to keep him away from the world. A few days later, orderlies found Sumit hanging from the ceiling of his cell. To the hospital staff, it was the final act of a man who had lost his grip on reality. For Sumit, the act was a final attempt to escape a presence that no one else would admit was there. He chose to end his life rather than remain a witness to whatever was following him. Was there truly something on that highway that the police couldn't find? Or did the isolation of the jungle simply leave a man with no other way out?